welcome back to the Murmurations podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr Tony Sampson. Tony's a reader in digital media culture and communication at the University of East London. Good morning, Tony.
Good morning, Darren.
I was going to take the mick out of the Spurs result last night, but seeing as Chelsea lost to West Ham 2 nights ago, I can't really say anything at the moment.
What a disaster.
Yeah, it was a disaster.
Mourinho is livid.
Yeah, more VAR controversy.
Yeah.
Okay, I wanted to talk to you today about a number of things to do with your research and teaching profile, and we'll probably run through a few of your books and kind of general research activity that the two of us have talked about quite a lot in recent years. But before we get to that, do you want to give us just a general overview and background introduction to your general research and teaching?
Yeah, okay. So I work at the University of East London, where I'm based really in a media and communications department within a larger school called Arts and Digital Industries. My teaching covers roughly media at MA level, PhD students. I teach on the BA as well. But I've been teaching really in the area of design for quite a few years. So I'm a bit of an unusual fit in the sense that I'm kind of media, but with one foot in design. So I've been leading and teaching for a number of years on digital media courses. So I specialise in areas such as user experience design, HCI, that sort of thing. So a bit of an unusual fit, but or you might call it a unique fit.
Yeah.
I also work quite a lot with the art students because we run quite a lively prof doc in fine art, and I supervise quite a lot of their projects. So I'm spread over quite a wide area actually. So that's my teaching. Research wise, I've been involved in quite a few kind of research projects, books, etc. over the years. Again, really focusing on broadly digital media cultures. So that's a wide range, but perhaps when we get to talk about the books, I can sort of add some more detail to that.
Yeah, sure. Well, should we start with Virality, which was your book, came out, I think, in 2012, was it?
That's right. Long time ago.
Yeah, and that talked a lot about contagion theory in relation to networks and social media.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a bit more about Virality and what was involved in that book?
Yeah, okay. I mean, it's probably worth going back to my PhD, really, I suppose. But I've always had this kind of strong interest in digital media technologies. So around the time of PhD, I was looking for some sort of project that I could get involved in. I had a certain amount of interest in coding and some applications I was using at the time. And after talking to some people, some supervisors or potential supervisors, I started thinking of how I could look at some interesting aspect of coding, some alternative coding. So I started to investigate computer viruses to start off with, and was doing quite an extensive study on a kind of history of computer viruses, some ideas around how computer viruses might be theorized. But around that time, I also received an email from a colleague of mine called Jussi Parikka, who I think this is as early as 2004, I think, who turned around and said that he was studying pretty much the same thing. And his book, Digital Contagions, was a kind of result of that. So I had a bit of a crisis during that period of time when I had to suddenly rethink what I was doing. And also around that time, I was in contact with Luciana Parizzi and Tiziana Terranova, who were both based at UEL at this time. And they said, well, you can still stay on the kind of contagion theory aspect and still look at media contagion. But had I looked at the work of Gabriel Tard, who was a kind of, as you might know now, yes, kind of sociologist from the kind of origins of sociology along with Durkheim. And that really changed the whole kind of angle of research and perspective that I was developing, and really just took off from there. And that's the result, was Virality, really, in the end. That's the book several years later, somewhere down the line. And someone always said to me, a PhD isn't a book. And that was true, because the PhD has nothing to do with a book. The book is a completely new invention, but that's where it all started. So I mean, just out of interest, so virality ended up spinning this kind of media theory of contagion. Somewhere down the line, that's actually been the book that's drawn most attention to my work. And I've got stories of people like Snapchat contacting me quite some time ago to ask how my theories of virality fit with their ideas about virality growth, which is their kind of economic model, or was their economic model at the time. And so even in the more recent book, I've kind of started covering how virality has changed over the years and the different kind of aspects of virality.
So off the back of virality, you moved towards, over the next few years after that, your next book, which was The Assemblage Brain.
Yeah, sure.
Do you want to just expand a little bit to talk about that project and how it was your next kind of stepping stone on from virality and what you were doing in that project?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the the common sort of threads that go from both books is this work of Gabriel Tard. So The Assemblage Brain, like virality, is still a contagion theory book. In fact, I look at it as kind of part of a trilogy of books that I've written, like Lord of the Rings or something. But so this this Gabriel Tard contagion theory thing needed to be expanded upon. I always looked upon virality as more of a kind of literature review, and by the time I got to The Assemblage Brain, I was kind of thrashing out a kind of methodology. Incidentally, at the same time, and this is quite an important detail, my teaching at UEL and around the design things I spoke about earlier, particularly around UX design, led me to go to quite a number of seminars in London. This was probably at the start of a kind of burgeoning UX design industry in the city of London. And I went to lots of seminars, industry seminars, where we started to hear more and more about the way that the brain works in these kind of design strategies. So this would go right from, how's the sound, Darren? Sorry.
Sounds still good. I'll shout if it's not.
Okay, you might just have to cut that. So I'll just start again. So I was attending more and more of these UX design seminars, and there was lots and lots of stuff around the brain. So I was interested in one particular book, which was called Neuro Web Design, which kind of referred to all these kind of neuroscientific techniques and how they could be utilized to improve the user experience, to maximize, purchase intent, to improve the kind of, the consumer experience online. And so I started to think, well, how does that bear up with the work of Gabriel Tard? These kind of two interests. On one hand, this kind of increasing interest in neuro, and on the other hand, the contagion theory. And so I started looking at Tard's work more closely around his ideas about the brain. And without going into too much detail about Tard here, he was interested in imitation and how society kind of formed around imitation. In fact, he actually says society is imitation. So it's quite an interesting thing where maybe we can talk about that a little bit more. But the kind of organ that this kind of galvanizes around this imitation society is the brain. And so I was really interested in how maybe Tard's ideas around the brain could be in some way used to think through this increasing interest in the UX industry around the brain and the appeals made to that. So if you get into some of the detail of the book, it kind of navigates its way through a kind of Tardian contagion theory alongside these ideas around UX. Okay, I mean, just to add, also at that time, this idea around the neuro just was getting so blown out. We had every sort of subject or every discipline seemed to have neuro put in front of it. Okay. So one obvious thing here is neuromarketing, and a lot of the hype around neuromarketing I was interested in at the time, but also neuroaesthetics, which equally makes some quite crazy claims. And one of my favorite was neurotheology. So everything at the time seemed to have the kind of the prefix of neuro added to it.
Yeah.
So that's what I meant by neuroculture.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because on the one hand, like as you were saying, that there's a healthy interest in or turn towards the neurological focus. But at the same time, I think sometimes we've talked in the past about how some analysis can be quite not just reductive, but it can jump to the point of explaining things through a almost reductive neurological perspective that lacks the critical social perspective that we would typically talk about in our fields. Do you want to just discuss the way in which, rather than just thinking of it as the neuro expanding our kind of media and cultural toolkits that we're familiar with,
Sure.
The stuff that we typically do in critical research actually harnesses the neurological perspective as well?
Yeah, sure. I mean, really, I must start by saying I'm a critical theorist.
Yes,
That's
absolutely.
my area. So these books are all about critical theory.
Yeah.
I studied the beginning of the assemblage brain, the introduction, critical theory, and I'm kind of like it's quite controversial, I suppose, because one of my critiques of the kind of tradition in critical theory is that it strikes up a big distance between itself and the kind of sciences that it looks at. So yeah, we always talk about critical distance and remaining kind of aloof. I read some quite interesting stuff by Kate Howes actually about that, and how really the humanities, particularly the critical area in the humanities, really needs to get away from that kind of aloofness and become more involved in the topics that it's kind of investigating and critiquing. So the whole of the beginning of the assemblage brain actually sets out an agenda which I call dystopian media theory, right? Which is actually a bit of a joke, but I've developed even more in the latest book. But you know, it's quite down on its subject, that thus the kind of dystopian aspect. But if you look at the way that dystopias are kind of been studied, and if you look at the kind of history of you know, the kind of William Burroughs kind of dystopia, you know, Aldous Huxley, and how Burroughs' dystopia becomes a big important part of the Control Society by Deleuze. If you look at that, there's some really interesting things, because it's almost like we're riding a kind of paradox. You know, on one half you have that kind of coercive, persuasive, manipulative kind of media, whereas on the other half you have this kind of surrender of the individual or of a collective to the kind of slave kind of mentality, right? So I was quite interested in, you know, how control worked, but also how acquiescence worked. So how people give up to these kind of systems. So that's one aspect about my critical theory. So the other one is also to break down this idea of distance. So to try and say, well, actually, I'm not going to be a critical theorist who remains aloof, remains distant from the subject. I'm actually going to get stuck in to the subject matter itself. So there's quite a lot of sort of techie detail and science detail. You know, I say in there that if anyone ever turns around to a critical theorist and says, well, you don't do neuroscience, how can you talk about it? We've kind of lost the battle straight away if that's our attitude. You know, we must be able to make a reading of this stuff to critique it. The worst kind of critique is the critique that just doesn't understand it.
Yes.
You know, so we've got to try to understand it and bear up to those kind of criticisms. So, you know, I'd already come from a tradition of that kind of thing. When I did the computer virus stuff, I was kind of working in an area called software studies, and that was all premised on the idea that you really did have some idea about how software worked. You know, a lot of people in software studies, for example, have got experience coding.
Yeah.
So not just talking about algorithmic logic as a kind of control mechanism that they don't actually understand. They do actually know how it works. And I think that's interesting, because it kind of then reveals kind of more glitchy, accidental kind of aspects of science and technology that most scientists and engineers know about, but won't tell you a lot about it. So you know, you get to know that, you know, well, one of the things about the neuro thing, when I started writing the assemblage brain, so that was probably when virality came out, 2012, came out in 2016. Around that time, the idea was that neuro was going to be completely dominant. Well, that seems to have gone off a little bit at the moment. I don't know if you agree with that, but I reckon most of that is due to the fact that a lot of the claims made during the time, those kind of, you know, claims made for the research grants, probably didn't come to fruition. You know, if you listen to a lot of the claims of neuroaesthetics about how they can tell where beauty is in the brain, you know, it's like almost locationist kind of thinking. You know, put someone in front of a piece of art and then scan the brain and try and find where beauty is. I mean, it's a ridiculous premise.
Yeah.
So, you know, a lot of that hype has sort of died down now. But yeah. So dystopian media theory.
I think partly what you were talking about as well there, similar in fields of consciousness studies as well.
Right.
The kind of the reductive materialist perspective stimulated something early on that was intuitive and drew attention to certain components of neuroscience that need to be considered and understood and thought about, but didn't provide the entire what was too reductive in terms of the materialist approach to the brain, that wasn't considered enough about other communicative practices in culture and society. But on that point, you mentioned previously when you came to Newcastle to talk to us that you, rather than that potential response you said about a moment ago, where people can be dismissive and say, well, you're a critical theorist, you don't know the science. Sure. You actually got in the room with some of the neuroscientists that, and particularly the popular neuroscientists in the field, and got some quite positive responses from them, didn't you? Where they could tell you really understood the work and you really engaged with it, and they said, "Oh yeah, I didn't really think about it like that." Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, I don't know.
So wasn't always that response, but it wasn't always doom and gloom, was it? There were some quite constructive responses as well.
I must say, probably the most negative responses I've had is probably from my own kind, you know, from critical theorists. I did a talk in Germany when I was it's quite early days. I was invited over to Germany. To be honest with you, I can't even remember where now. It was not when I went in and went out very quickly. But I got a really hostile response from a critical sort of cultural theorist in there, who accused me of being on the side of science, you know. So just to flip that round, scientists are a little bit more polite, I found. So. I'm not too sure whether it was just the fact that I hadn't developed my ideas for the assembly's brain, the kind of critical theory angle enough, or this person didn't want to engage at all with anything that had any kind of scientific kind of content in it. But I come from an area loosely called new materialism, you know, also associated with affect theory, and really, you know, we're openly interested in what science has to say and what science can add to theory. So it is at odds with a lot of the humanities, more so than it probably would be with some of the scientists.
Yeah.
So we're kind of stuck in a bit of an unusual kind of island in the middle. But you know, I must say equally there are some examples of new materialism and affect theory where the science is badly applied and almost sort of wears a target on itself. You know, come and get me. I don't really know what I'm talking about. So the pressure is always on when you take on a project to really kind of get into the kind of scientific papers and understand them the best you can. You know, so if it's got a good response, then great. And
excellent. Well, that point about affect theory that you mentioned a minute ago and the importance of interdisciplinarity. Affect theory is a kind of growing field in terms of its popularity in the last sort of decade or so.
Sure.
Is it that kind of radical interdisciplinarity that you think is partly responsible for its appeal across so many disciplines within and beyond the social sciences, because it is able to connect and integrate those other perspectives that you were talking about?
Yeah, if I can try and remember to deal with this in two ways, because I want to talk a little bit about how it's kind of spread and become more influential. But I just want to make a connection with what we were talking about earlier about the interest in science. So for me, what affect theory does, and this is why I like it, is it kind of challenges that centrality of human consciousness that a lot of the particularly humanities and social sciences have had for so long. I remember years ago, someone arguing with me at a conference about representation, and you know, we only think in representations. You know, this is where science is actually coming quite useful. You know, there is a kind of an approach in neuroscience, or the neurosciences, they're not just one thing, where consciousness itself has been kind of quite challenged, you know, And there's this whole idea of what we call the non-conscious, not the unconscious, not any kind of, you know, sort of repressed, hidden, dreamlike theatre world of unconscious, but a non-conscious. Non-conscious is a very kind of thing, you know, things that are controlling things that you do, and, you know, I don't know, behaviours and habits, but don't appear in consciousness. I mean, the most radical neuroscience says there's something like, you know, a sort of, I don't know, 20-80 split, with only sort of, you know, 20% of it being consciousness. And some of it's even less than that, 5%. So, you know, affect theory for me is really interesting because it comes from a very sort of similar way, and sort of says, well, consciousness isn't all. So, you know, I had an interesting dialogue with Kate Howes, again, to mention her, published in the Capacious. I always say Capacious journal, Greg Sidgworth's journal. And the dialogue really revolves around her accusation that affect theory, or new materialism, did a good thing by saying, well, hang on, you know, consciousness isn't all. We need to kind of think of theories where we kind of destabilize, decentralize consciousness. But what she goes on to say is that they made the big mistake by ignoring consciousness, not having any explanation for it. Well, see, I kind of disagree with that. You know, I think you can decenter it and look at it from another perspective, but you know, it doesn't mean that we're ignoring it. And my project really, from the assemblage brain through until the current work, is trying to think about, you know, well, okay, you know, we all have a who am I kind of question, a kind of phenomenological kind of question in our heads about who we are. But, you know, going back to Tard, he challenged that as being the kind of, you know, the best way to kind of analyze things, because, you know, if we discount things like our non-consciousness, if we discount those kind of things that are outside of consciousness having an influence on that kind of way in which we kind of, you know, centralize our thinking, then we miss most of it.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's discounting consciousness. It's just saying, well, we need to think of consciousness as being inclusive of all the non-conscious influences.
To listeners who are less familiar with the field that we're talking about, I think sometimes the easier way of breaking up these components we're talking about is that there's consciousness in the way we typically talk about it in terms of the human experience and what we understand it to be human and us thinking, and all those other neurobiological factors that might sometimes be described as the non-conscious, but they're there making everything happen, but they're not necessarily included in what we typically talk about in terms of the mind and the conscious mind and so on.
Yeah, at the worst case, when you mentioned sort of that reductive materialist kind of angle, you know, consciousness is in the neuron, consciousness is in the sort of synaptic gap or whatever. So that's the worst kind of materialist sort of thing, that, you know, consciousness actually emerges from the kind of parts of the brain, right? So I'm not particularly interested in that, and I've critiqued that for the same reasons that you mentioned earlier, really. Yeah. But I'll tell you, you know, Gabriel Tard says that we have a number of kind of selves, right? One of the selves, he says, is a psychological self, and that is the one I think you're referring to there. It's the one that we feel that we are. You know, I am me. You know, we all have that kind of. You know, Kate Howes' point is that we wouldn't be able to think of all these complex ideas about non-consciousness unless we had that kind of, you know, self that we translate all that through. Right? That's the self that writes and thinks and does all the rational stuff, the cognitive self. Sometimes
referred to as the illusion of the self.
Yeah, well, this is exactly the point that Tard makes. So Tard's Society of Imitation is that we are all part of this big imitation cycle and flows, right? Micro flows of imitation. Yeah. And the psychological self is really just a kind of almost something that's made to understand that, or not necessarily understand it, to actually, you know, to actually exist in it. That we kind of have to kind of have this kind of, you know, centered self. So you know, so my whole point here is quite simple. It's I don't disagree with the idea that we have a self, but it's necessary to decenter it and consider all the non-conscious stuff, because otherwise we miss the whole trick.
I really like at the moment the growing conversation around something that my mate said he was interested in a while back, and when he said it, I was kind of like, oh, was a bit bonkers, but some of it makes a lot of sense. And there's a growing interest in something called panpsychism.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And the idea that actually, if we're really talking about the non-conscious, what we typically call the non-conscious sort of components of things that create consciousness in its entirety, then there might still be material things, but they're not necessarily reductive to brains. And the idea that there are so many objects that we look at as being dead objects in some way contain whatever consciousness might be. They have consciousness because they have those aspects of matter that are running through everything beyond human beings that make the universe happen. And that's actually where consciousness might arise from, whatever it is that's pushing that.
Yeah, sure. I covered that in the assemblage brain because one of the people I'm interested in is Whitehead. Alfred North Whitehead. So what he was into things like that. I mean, he's got this really broad kind of complex understanding of what feeling is, and he talks about how the stone feels the sun. That's which good idea, example of his kind of panpsychism. There's lots of different areas of that some I agree with more than others. Other kind of cognitive views of kind of distributed cognition through objects. I find that less attractive to the way in which we might think of consciousness being something completely different to the human experience of that.
Yes.
But, being in matter itself, vital matter.
Yeah.
So he was really interested in that, just as a reference. Stephen Shaviro, his kind of work, and
of course,
the way they use kind of fabulations, science, sci-fi to kind of look at what consciousness could be. I can't remember whether it was him or whether I read it somewhere else. But he said, if computers ever developed a consciousness, we wouldn't recognise it because it wouldn't be anything like our consciousness. Yeah. If a stone has consciousness, again, we wouldn't recognise it because it wouldn't be anything. We've got no kind of registers in which to kind of compare it to. But so there's a big chunk of us, the assemblage brain, given over to that kind of discussion.
Well, my mate who mentioned panpsychism to me quite a few years back, it was the Shaviro stuff that he just read that he made him to me, and I was a bit like, I don't get all this. But what I really did like more recently was quite a brief introduction, but a really, really concise and clearly well written book by Annika Harris.
Oh right, okay.
She's done a book about consciousness where panpsychism is her kind of endpoint that she reaches in there, and she's written it really well, and I think it would be of interest to audiences beyond the fields that we work in, so readerships beyond the fields we work in. Moving on to more recent work you've done. You've recently been working on a book called The Sleepwalker's Guide to Social Media. Is that just come out or just coming out?
Yeah.
If the video works,
if this is audio only, you won't be able to see that. Yeah, it came out in June, so quite early in June. I'm always surprised with academic publishers because you hear about horrendous long queues, but if you go through the production process, suddenly they just come out all of a sudden. So I was expecting it to come out in early July, and in early June, the guy emailed me and said, "Your books are here. Would you like some copies?" So it's out. So So let's make a bridge here. So I said originally that there were kind of 3 books in this trilogy, my Lord of the Rings, but the latter one really explores. I mean, the title, The Sleepwalker's Guide to Social Media. Someone said the other day that I needed a subtitle to let everyone know what that means. But if you've ever followed the kind of the Gabriel Tard, the Gabriel Tard idea about society, you'd know that one of the key terms he uses is the somnambulist, or the sleepwalker. So the sleepwalker for Tard is exactly what we're talking about in terms of kind of non-conscious and consciousness. So it's more than that, actually. It's not just kind of individual conscious and non-conscious. It is the collective non-conscious. So we go a little bit further with Tard, but consciousness itself isn't something that just resides in individuals. It's something that resides in societies, in collectives. There's nothing new here, of course, because Durkheim said pretty much the same thing. In fact, Durkheim saw society as the consciousness of consciousness, or the collective consciousness, the kind of almost like cognitive global awakening of brains as a society. But what Tard does, which is unique and makes him very different to Durkheim, is that his collective consciousness is non-conscious. Okay, so it comes back to all those things we were talking about in neuroscience, but kind of stretched out and imagined as being part of collectives. And so what I wanted to do really is look at a whole range of ideas of how you could approach the contemporary situation. I was looking at post-Cambridge Analytica. I was looking at the rise of Trump, rise of race hate, race hate speech, all on social media, all the kind of bad dystopian media theory stuff about social media. And again, trying to think about how we could apply Tard and Tard's Sleepwalker to each of those things. And so the Sleepwalker guide is just that. It's how do we think of these things according to kind of Tard's Sleepwalker.
Excellent. I was going to mention that point you were saying, and in relation to Murmurations, as in the name of this podcast. Murmurations was a metaphor that I used in Media and Effective Mythologies, where I was kind of pointing to the similar thing of what you were talking about a moment ago, is that if we all share these same non-conscious components, and there are communicative and affective and emotive practices out there in society and media and politics and so on that we're all responding to, it makes sense that we have these kind of patterns of behavior and shared perceptions and what you talked about in contagion theory as well, right back in virality. It makes sense that these things, that you get these phenomena occurring collectively because we're all responding in certain ways to the similar kind of media and culture that we're consuming. Sure.
I used the Murmuration to introduce a lecture on what I call pass-on power. Right. So pass-on power is really that within networks, people pass on things kind of almost in an unconscious way or non-conscious way. So, large, big events kind of emerge from very small origins. But a lot of the kind of things that are spread in that emergence of that big event and are not really known. So they're not sort of cognitive. So it's really a contrast with sort of collective intelligence, smart mob, the idea that all the small things that emerge in this kind of cognitive thinking global brain. I'm looking at it emerges more in a kind of non-conscious brain.
Yeah. Have you had any responses to this book yet? Have you shared much of the material from this at the conferences you've been to? And have you had any kind of general idea of how people are receiving it at the moment?
Well, it's had some initial fairly good reviews, so I'm quite optimistic about that. Right. I must say the whole COVID situation has not lent itself entirely to the going to conferences and talking about it. I had a wonderful invite over to speak in the States at Duke just prior to all this happening, and unfortunately that was cancelled. But that was based on the assemblage brain and some of the stuff I published prior to this book, which part of a feature of it. So it all looked quite good. Yeah. But I suppose on the other hand, I've been told that people are buying more books and sitting home reading during lockdown. So I wait to see the royalty check to see if that reflects any of that.
And how's the obvious answer to this question is the same as this has been interrupted by COVID, but your conference series on social media.
Yeah.
Do you want to just say a bit about that? Because one thing that I've been talking to people about on the podcast is just some of the smaller networks that we can get involved in across these fields of research, and also how collaborative they are and supportive they are for PhDs and early career researchers.
Yeah, okay. I'll give you a bit of a background story of that. So many years ago, we were offered some money to get students involved in research projects. And I'd be honest, I wrote it on the back of a fag packet, well, I like effect, and we kind of do social media. So I got one of my undergraduates to set up a seminar You know, I did some of the publicity with them, and we called it, I think we called it social media and affect at that stage, funny enough. And that was quite some while ago. And a friend of mine, a psychologist at UEL, had a book about emotional psychology, Darren Ellis, and two friends, and Ian Tucker. And they said, can we do a book launch as well? And we put the, you know, the call for papers out. And I just thought it was going to be like a few people, local, you know, UEL types, maybe some others in London. And we got a really good response, you know, more than just a seminar, more like a kind of symposium kind of thing. So that was great. So the following year, I thought, well, let's try that again. And we did it, and we just got more and more stuff. What we were noticing was the kind of interdisciplinarity of the you know, the responses. I mean, psychology is an obvious area, but art, you know, cultural theory. So, you know, affect itself travels very well across disciplines. So yeah, it's just grown and grown. The last one, which was going to be our 5th one. Let's talk about the 4th one. The 4th one, we had Patricia Clough come from the States. Greg Seedworth came from the States as well, and yeah, amazing event. So the 5th one was going to be even bigger and better, you know, as these things tend to grow. And we had a fantastic program. In fact, the day I postponed it, I'd actually finished the program, and it was all confirmed. So we postponed it. In a way, it was good we got that far, because I'm hoping I can just go back, pick it up, and just put it back on once all stuff's over. Yeah. But we have, in the meantime, got a 4.5. So I'll do a plug for that now. On my blog, which is the Virality blog, so if you search for Tony Sampson plus Virality blog, you'll find it on Google. We're going to run 4.5. So it's not a full one. The university said, well, let's do one online. Well, I've kind of compromised. I don't believe that conferences necessarily work so well online. You know, I'm probably going to be proved wrong, because it's probably the only way they're going to happen in the short term, at least. But yeah, so 4.5 is a collection, and we've had something like, you know, 30, 40 bits sent to us. I say bits because they're performances from artists. They're video links of people doing papers as performance. It's a real kind of mix of stuff, very exciting material. And so on the 16th and 17th of July, we're going to kind of introduce the program in the morning, the afternoon, and in the evening. So it's going to have a kind of conferencey feel to it, and obviously circulate, you know, as things happen through social media. So if people are listening and it comes out before the 16th of July, please check out my blog, and you'll see this stuff unfold as the day goes on.
Brilliant.
So
brilliant. Sounds great. Well, I'm quite strict with time on these, and we're just about done for time now, to be honest.
Oh,
but
great.
That was a really rich conversation. I think people will find that really interesting, whether they're familiar with the fields of research that we're working or not, to be honest. So thank you very much for your time, Tony.
Yeah, cheers, Darren. Nice to hear from you again. Yeah,
nice to speak to you. Take care, and I'll speak to you again soon. Thank you.
Okay, see you. Bye.